Well, hello, friends. My name is Kevin, and I'd like to welcome you to Via Media's very first conversational interview. And let me tell you, I am absolutely thrilled and humbled to host our very first guest, Jeremy Lent, who is the author of some phenomenal books. The first one, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And the follow-up book to that, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. This is going to be the topic of our conversation for tonight. And for those of you who are watching live, you'll see the Slido event number down at the bottom of the screen. You're welcome to submit questions, and we will ask questions of Jeremy throughout and towards the end. Jeremy, thank you so much. I'm incredibly humbled and honored that you would join us tonight.
Oh, yeah. I'm happy to be here, Kevin, and so looking forward to our conversation with you.
Okay, so let's start with a quote from your book. This is Patterning Instinct, page 25. There seems little doubt that we are currently in the midst of one of the great critical transitions of the human journey. And yet it is not at all clear where we will end up once our current system resolves into a newly stable state. My hope in writing this book is that it can offer a valuable framework for readers to come to their own assessment of humanity's future path and their own potential role in shaping it. I love that quote because that is exactly what we would like to do here. And what I'd like to ask you basically is, what then is that critical transition that we are in based upon your basic work? How would you sum up what that critical transition is?
Yeah. And that is a key theme, both in that book, The Patterning Instinct, and The Web of Meaning, and basically all the work that I'm doing right now. Because I think what is pretty clear to anybody who's looking at what's unfolding in the world right now is we are going through not just a change of an era or something like that, but really one of the most profound transformations in the human experience that's happened since we first evolved as human beings. And in that book, The Patterning Instinct, I look at some of those transformations. The first really was when we went from being nomadic hunter-gatherers, where we spend like 95+% of human history, to settling down with agrarian civilizations. That changed just about everything in what humans experience. And the other one, really as large, is probably the rise of the scientific revolution in Europe a few hundred years ago, when again, it took a couple hundred years to unfold, but then it changed just about everything. We're going through something similar this century, maybe even bigger. The question is, obviously, that nobody has a real answer to is, what is that transformation going to look like after it's happened? Yeah. And there's really, we can kind of identify really, I think, three potential pathways which kind of constellate into different trajectories. One is basically collapse, which is something that more and more scientists around the world, we're talking about serious, conservative, thoughtful scientists, not like people out in some radical fringe, are saying that if we don't change what we're doing, this is where our civilization is headed. Not just climate breakdown, but ecological devastation, the incredible inequities getting worse and worse. These are driving us to a path of potential collapse. The second scenario is somewhat more subtle, and I would say from a moral perspective is even more egregious than allowing this collapse, which is a kind of a bifurcation of the human species. Some call it like a fortress Earth, where the global elite managed to sort of segment themselves off from the collapse that's taking place basically everywhere else around them, but then use that almost like a new feudalism, if you will, use their powers to do their techno enhancements and their genetic enhancements and all the stuff they want to do, right, but like let the rest of humanity collapse around them. That may be the path that we're actually headed on, maybe even more than collapse, potentially. We can't know that. The third scenario is the one that anyone who basically has a beating heart and looks and cares about what's going on would want, which is to transform this devastating trajectory we're on right now, to transform it at such deep levels that we can actually change the human trajectory to something positive, to what I often call like future flourishing, like where we can actually have a more, not just sustainable, but regenerated Earth, where basically we can have the conditions for every human being to live a life of dignity.
Yeah. Are you suggesting those technocratic elites don't have a beating heart? Is that, I mean, and some of this is getting to, I think, the big question of your book, because all of that is basically based upon this patterning instinct, and are not those people just simply following the basic pattern? So can you, let's expand that a little bit more. So you have these three visions that we have some options, and I would say that your third option is the one that many of us are yearning for, but yet we're still stuck in a different pattern. So can you help us understand kind of the trajectory of that patterning and how we've gotten to this particular point where we have those two options, and how this third option can actually manifest itself?
Yeah, I mean, these are obviously profound questions. And just to answer that kind of half in jest statement, it's a fair question. Honestly, I think very, very few people, other than basically sociopaths or psychopaths, would want that second scenario where most of the human race is suffering a terrible collapse while they sort of branch themselves off. What I think goes on, and I think this is true not just of some micro global elite, but almost anybody who is living in the global north right now, who's doing fairly well and is aware of what's going on. There's this part of us, we say, oh, this is really terrible what's happening. And then there's other part that says, I need to look out for myself and my family. Right. And like, what's a good place to live? If climate breakdown's happening here, maybe we should move to... And implicitly, anyone who has those thoughts, and I'll put myself in that category at times, we're all implicitly part of that second morally egregious trajectory if we don't really invest ourselves into that change. So I just kind of wanted to make that clear. I'm not just pointing fingers at a few billionaires, whatever.
I think I say that also, I say it in jest, but I also say it with a recognition. Like when I was going through your work, I was recognizing I'm a part of that too. I ask, I'm because this is the milieu that I'm a part of and the culture that I'm a part of, I'm asking those same questions. I'm operating by the same concepts and worldviews. And so one of the reasons why having a conversation with you and your ideas, I think it's just so tremendously important, is because it's kind of that kick in the pants wake up call to start to say, wait a second, the conceptual framework by which I'm operating is part of the problem. It's not just the decisions that I'm making, it's the framework out of which I make decisions. So that's kind of what I want to get to. And I think the vast majority of the people that I'm in conversations with, including myself, we just don't understand that conceptual framework. So
so I'm happy then to kind of turn to that deeper question you're asking. And when you're talking about conceptual frameworks, as you know, Kevin, I write a lot about what I use the word worldview to describe that, which is basically a worldview is not just kind of a particular viewpoint. It's basically like the lens through which we see and make sense of everything that happens around us. And the reason it's so important to recognize that there are worldviews is because it's really just like when we use our eye is a lens and we use it to look at things, but we don't know until some biologist explains to us that we're actually are looking at things through a lens, and the world out there doesn't necessarily look the way we think it does, but we kind of, and because we see everything through it, that's what we think it actually is. Similarly with a worldview is basically this total framework with which we understand things. And it's not something that is explicitly taught to a child. It's not like somebody sort of sits the child on his knee at age like 6 or 7 and says, now, let me tell you, this is how our world works. Here's how you make sense of it. It's basically, it's implicit. And which is why I call that first book I wrote the patterning instinct, because as humans, we have this instinct to pattern meaning into the universe around us. And it's that original patterning instinct that led to humans making sense of things through a worldview. And worldviews, they're very conservative in a sense. They don't change very frequently because it's so embedded in our unconscious. We're not conscious of them. But one way in which we can become more aware of a worldview and shift it is by realizing there are other worldviews out there. So a lot of my work looks at this shifts in worldviews. First, you had a nomadic hunter-gatherer worldview that saw the world basically as like a sort of giving parent and everything around them as like family. And then you had an agrarian worldview, which was very based on hierarchies. Everything's a hierarchy, both in your society and the gods. And then you had the scientific worldview, which arose again in Europe around the 17th century. And that worldview was very different from what had come before, even though it had its antecedents in actually the Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. So right now we used to think nowadays of Christianity and religion being opposed to each other. Mm-hmm. But what's fascinating is that the scientific revolution pioneers in the 17th century were all devout Christians and felt they were doing God's work, whether it was Galileo, Newton, or whoever they were. And this worldview is a worldview of dualism. The reason why it was inherited from Christianity is because Christianity and other dualistic religions, such as Islam, had this notion of two separate universes, a sacred domain and a polluted worldly domain. And in Christianity, the human soul sort of would connect you with that heavenly domain. And the world became basically desacralized, no longer seen as this place which had its own intrinsic spiritual value, but it was more like a kind of a theater, which the sort of battle of the soul against its temptations was played or whatever. The scientists kind of inherited that worldview, and they thought their job was to look at this kind of machine that God had made and break it apart to understand how it worked. And they did such a great job of that. It's basically what we know nowadays as reductionism. They did such a great job of that it transformed everything around our world. We can thank that for our ability to talk to each other right now over the internet, others to see what we're doing. We can thank that for the germ theory of disease, which has so powerfully changed human well-being. And so one thing to really understand is I celebrate so many of the advances that arose from that worldview. But because of this way in which it saw the world as a machine, like this core metaphor, and because it was so powerful, people got to think that metaphor, which was a useful way of understanding things, was the reality itself. So we've now gotten to the point here in the modern age when it's considered completely the norm to actually see the world, the rest of non-human nature as a machine, to see animals basically not as having intrinsic value in themselves, but as being essentially like kind of driven by their selfish genes to do what they will. And even our own bodies the same way. Here in Silicon Valley, people talk about the sort of wetware of the body and the software, as if we can actually separate these things out. That split, in that dualistic split, and that seeing nature as a machine, are some of the fundamental reasons why we've driven to this place of complete imbalance with the rest of life on Earth.
Well, and I feel like let's draw those connections. So the agrarian, the primary, you would call it a pattern or the metaphor that we use, the conceptual framework, giving parent. Now, is that the first step of the bifurcation? Is that the first step, or is that how would you call that? Like an intermediary step? I mean, if you
so basically, if we look at one way we can sort of explore this, as I think you're moving towards, is really looking at this current dominant worldview as a worldview of separation,
right,
as opposed to a worldview of deep interconnectedness. And I think it is possible to actually look at like sort of basically there's kind of maybe three or four major steps in that separation that has led to this place. The first step comes even really with the evolution of human beings themselves and the development of what in my work I call our conceptual consciousness, this ability to see ourselves as separate from the rest of life, to have self-awareness, and that also allows us to actually think symbolically, which led to the evolution of language, basically. So now we're talking about the very, like hundreds of thousands of years ago, the development of this conceptual consciousness. That led to really the first split between humans and the rest of the living Earth. And it also did lead some of the great mass extinctions that happened on Earth since humans arose came, the extinctions of megafauna in different continents came even before we settled down for agriculture.
Right.
but because humans developed these powers over the rest of life on Earth that no other species had developed before. That's step number one.
Mm.
Step number two was the rise in agriculture, when we put up fences and basically said, out there is like the wilderness, and here on this side is what is sort of cultivated and culture. And we also put up fences against other human beings and said, I own this territory. If you don't own as big a lot, too bad for you. I'll employ you. I'll make you a slave, and then you can work on my land. So that
Right.
led to these hierarchies. So
Yep.
that's the second level of separation, which kind of described virtually every agrarian civilization around the world. And the next level of separation really happened not with the scientific revolution, but with the ancient, well, I say with the ancient Greeks, but it happened, we can try to parse through exactly when this happened. There was
Yeah.
this rise of the sense of dualism, because these agrarian civilizations, they saw the gods as being hierarchies, but they didn't see a clear split between humans and the spirit world. And almost every civilization had this notion of spirits that was sort of quasi-tangible. And your body, you sort of became the spirit after you died. And there was this kind of step of gradations between humans and the spiritual world. With dualism, we had this utter split, two different universes, one sacred dimension of what Plato called the good,
Hmm.
and here was the world, which was just kind of polluted. That's what led to this desacralization of the earth. So that's really the next split, which kind of got consolidated with the scientific revolution and the rise in reductionism.
Yeah.
And we could say there was one sort of final split that's really been happening in more recent times, with the rise of this exponential rise of technology, the rise of basically the corporation and global capitalism, which has almost completely split the human experience off from anything to do with the rest of life around us.
Yeah. Can we point that to a Platonic sense of ideals, right? So the Plato's not only is there a split, but there's also a prioritization of value. So the ideal actually becomes more important, more valuable, more good than the actual physical, and that makes its way into kind of Gnostic religions and Gnostic ideas.
Exactly.
And we're inheritors of this. So this is okay. So this is what I think is so critically important. What happened, and like what you said, there's nuances to the historical development, but we got a Platonic idea. We've got the development of Christianity that's trying to meld itself with the Hellenistic world, that basically takes this bifurcated sense of that which is up there, this is down here, and that which is up there is good. And so you have a split of the universe, which then turns into a mechanized sense of the universe, and that
Right.
the universe is essentially a machine, because the scientific revolution takes that idea and says, well, if that's the case, then we can learn the laws and the physics of exactly how this all works. And all of that cognitive history is what's deeply embedded in how we think. And the reason why I think your explanation of that is so incredibly powerful is that's what gets us to the confinement of animals for our food. This is what gets us to the destruction of our ecology and deforestation, because if this physical world in which we're living in is just merely a machine that we can extrapolate value out of, then it almost doesn't matter, or it matters greatly, but it matters based upon the values of that conceptual framework.
That's right. And in fact, that is even embedded in our language. Like when we talk about things like fish stocks or whatever, we sort of think of, we actually look at the language itself as just kind of creating like things as resources. So even the very nature, there's even this a more progressive, thoughtful, sensible approach to looking at the future, saying what we're doing is unsustainable, and we need to come up with a sustainable way to relate to nature. But even that oftentimes still views the rest of life on Earth as just a resource for human consumption.
Right.
But it's a little bit more enlightened and says we're kind of blowing through our resource. We need to exploit it more sustainably.
Right.
But the shift we're talking about that's needed is something that goes to a deeper place, where we actually recognize that we are not separate from nature, that we actually, as human beings, we are part of life, that we evolved we actually share our heritage with all of life around us.
Right.
And we are, just as those nomadic hunter-gatherers saw, and as indigenous cultures still today explain very clearly, we are all family. We are all relatives. And once we start to look at that in a different way and start to realize that animals actually do have feelings. They actually, when a chicken is in one of these things called CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, and is just basically treated with its beak cut off and stuck in a cage, it is suffering. It's suffering in its own way, in just the same way that you or I would suffer if we were in that kind of place. Yeah. And it's that recognition that we have been divorced from.
Now, what is so, I think, intriguing and powerful is that if you were to say what you just said, kind of outside the context of the holistic work that you've done, by the way, footnotes galore and profound reference to peer-reviewed science, right? This, I mean, you're not messing around here with these books.
Right.
What is so profound is that the conclusion that you just drew can be seen by some, especially with this particular worldview. Oh, you're being like the environmentalist, you're being the kind of the spiritualist or whatever. But what you're doing here, and this is what I think is really important to articulate to our audience, is that you're actually bringing in scientific understandings as well as spiritual and indigenous wisdom, because they're all starting to come to the same conclusion. And in many ways, kind of the mechanistic pursuit of understanding is leading in some ways back to this fundamental truth. Like if you look at mycology, if you look at DNA, if you look at, even quantum mechanics, all these things are starting to lead to this conclusion. Can you share a little bit more about that journey?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kevin. And that really, in a way, kind of what we're doing now is shifting from the topic of that first book I wrote some years back, The Patterning Instinct, to the theme of this more recent book called The Web of Meaning. And as you mentioned before, the subtitle of it is Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And this is what this book really unfolds, is all of these things that we just described, this kind of reductionist worldview, seeing nature as a machine, and the stuff that many people in the world today think that is reality, that's hard science. What this book shows is that that is actually not hard science. What it is science as it was first explored back in the 17th century. Right. And in more recent decades, in more recent centuries, but it's certainly in more recent decades, a hardcore understanding of science has shown that these reductionist ways of looking at things to be misguided, basically to be limited, not to really understand what the world truly is about. Right. And the simple way to get at that is to understand that when I described earlier this sort of process of what's called reductionism, which is the way scientific works by reducing parts into its separate, everything into its separate parts and understanding better. That's how chemistry works with elements, biology with DNA or genes or whatever, and physics all the way down to quarks, whatever they might be. But in each case, these different, understanding these different parts, if people get too focused on that, then they create what I call ontological reductionism, which basically says we understand things so well through breaking it apart that that's the only way to understand everything about the universe, and any other approach has to be misguided. Right. That's the ontological mistake that oftentimes people make in that reductionist place. Right. So in modern decades, systems sciences, such as complexity science, network theory, you can look at sciences like evolutionary biology, cognitive anthropology, all these hardcore sciences more focused on looking at the connections between things than just the things themselves. And what we learn from these sciences is not that reductionism is wrong in any which way, but it only describes things to a limited degree. And when you start to look at what are known as complex systems, which basically means any system that is nonlinear and which describes any system that is living, or any system that's created by humans, as because we ourselves are living. And so we create like nonlinear systems. in all of these systems, they actually, as they get more and more complex, they lead to phase transitions, and they lead to a new state which you can only understand basically based on principles of how these things connect up. That doesn't mean that the stuff they're made of is invalid, but it means that that doesn't explain it at these higher levels. That's what complexity science, system science explains. But, and this is what's so fascinating, that leads to a shift in the very notion of what science is. Because rather than being this hardcore separation between science and, say, spirituality, and science and quality, which reductionism like says that's the only way to approach science.
Right.
When you start looking at the connections between things, you start to realize that, well, as the person looking at it, I'm actually, my very observing of this state affects the state, which is something discovered in quantum physics about 100 years ago or so. But it has implications in every aspect of our life. And it has implications in terms of looking at who we are as human beings and what is our true identity. Right. And even, and this is where it gets to the science leads naturally to really deep kind of spiritualness understanding, because our very identity itself, rather than being stuck at our physical bodies or whatever, we get to realize our consciousness itself and who we are is really arising from the interpenetration with all the other systems around us, that we are emergent entities. Yeah. And you begin to see things in this way that leads to all kinds of explorations.
I'm so tempted to want to ask you about panpsychism at this particular point to see how far we can push that idea, because there's profound implications to this new emerging idea of the interconnectedness, and that and if we were to just put it into practical terms, the very ways in which we navigate through this world can no longer be so isolated and individualistic. We have to recognize that everything that we do is both an effect and a cause of everything else around us, right? And,
right.
And
exactly.
This is the implication, I think, of this particular work. Okay, so I'd like to shift a little bit, because you mentioned spirituality, and still in some aspects of our culture, the split between science and spirituality still seems to be pretty robust.
Yes.
But what you're attempting to do is attack that in some particular way, or explain it away and recognize that the split really doesn't exist. So can you share a little bit more about indigenous wisdom and what it is telling us and how it is informing us, and how it could change the way in which we do scientific inquiry and worldview and philosophy and all those different types of things? And then I want to get to a little bit of the history of Christianity, for I come from an audience of people that adhere to a Christian idea and Christian worldview. And there's a part of me that also feels like the explanation of bringing in these other spiritualities that you've talked about, like Taoism and Buddhism and indigenous wisdom, can actually enlighten some of the parochial Christian views that is still very dominant in our culture. If that question made sense.
Yeah, totally. Let's start off with this, looking at what we can learn really from indigenous wisdom. Which, of course, we have to be careful. These kind of phrases become sort of cliches, or whatever, and there's so much complexity and so much heterogeneity within that. But there are some things we can find are kind of generally true of indigenous communities pretty much around the world. And I talked already earlier about how that early way of looking at humans being part of an extended family is something we inherited from the earliest times in our human history, and which virtually every indigenous, sort of intact indigenous culture still maintains in one form or another, that sense of connectedness. I think probably the most important thing that we can gain from indigenous cultures is when we look at their value, at the basically underlying value systems. Because one of the key things that's happened is, in these layers of separation that I've described, is that our society right now has a whole fundamentally different value system than actually is natural for what we are as human beings. Mm-hmm. Like when we evolved as human beings, really hundreds of thousands of years ago, even when we were sort of pre-human hominids, What actually separated us from other primates was the ability to share identity as groups. And we, over like basically a few million years before we evolved to be uniquely human, we developed what are known as moral emotions, which means that basically those early hominids that really saw themselves a part of a group and developed deeply felt group values. So they could do things like feel embarrassed or love somebody who they saw was generous, or feel shame if they did something wrong. These are very human ways of, these are basically group-based emotions. And what indigenous culture still holds today, the ones that are fairly intact, is a notion of a set of values based on that group identity. This doesn't mean the sort of group identity, meaning like, oh, we all have to lose our individual identity and just kind of become part of some hive and just get lost in groupthink, or all these ways in which our individualistic culture sort of confronts ideas of group identity. What it is rather that as humans, we evolved to want to be part of a group. And that's what actually allows us to feel well-being. And so indigenous cultures have core values of things like reciprocity, like a sense, not like reciprocity meaning in our sort of market-based culture, I'll give something to you and you give something of equal value back to me. But it's rather that I'll be generous to you and you'll be generous back to me. And if somebody is extra generous to me, I'll feel a sense I want to give something back to that person. And it's oftentimes is called a sort of gentle reciprocity, because it just kind of happens naturally because it feels right.
Can I interrupt you for just 1 second? Sure, because I can hear that word reciprocity through that old mechanistic kind of lens, which is exactly what you said. I give you X, you give, and there's almost an expected return. And this new shift, or this indigenous shift, or the, to be nuanced and careful with that, as you mentioned, is a recognition that reciprocity is kind of a fundamental way of being in the world and how the world works.
And that is the big distinction that we're talking about. And along with that, what we can then learn from those indigenous values. And again, this is where we find the intersection with systems thinking and modern science, is the very notion that our identity itself can have different layers. It doesn't have to be stuck in terms of me being separate. But I can have a family identity with the rest of my family, which obviously most of us are used to. That's something that fits within the dominant paradigm. We can have a group identity with our community. We can have an identity with all of humanity. And we can have an identity with all of life. And each of those identities doesn't have to mean that the other identity is wrong or invalid, but it really enlarges our exploration of what it can be to be human, to actually be able to exist in all of these different identities at different layers at different times.
Yeah, that's, man, I feel like just that little bit turn of the mindset could make such a radical difference in the world. But we're still stuck in this mindset. So let's move to how we get out of there. Well, actually, I wanted to back up because I wanted to ask you then about Christianity and its role and its development. Christianity, for better or for worse, is still a predominant force in the world, and all sorts of different iterations. And you seem to have critique. I don't want to say hostility, but some significant critique about Christianity. And I just kind of wanted to ask you about that, because towards the end of your work, you mentioned things like the Human Rights Declaration from the UN and these particular values of interconnectedness. And there's a part of me that has understood historically that Christianity, while it has been the vehicle for a Platonic understanding of a split universe that's led to the development of science and a mechanistic worldview, it has also been the vehicle of these very values that you're espousing at the end. So I kind of wanted to ask you about that, not from an apologetic perspective, but really trying to understand the complex history here. Because if you're, which I'm all for, attempting to get humanity to reconceive of its worldview, rethink of the patterns by which we live and the systems in which we participate and the interconnections that we all live by, then it feels to me as if religion and all religions in some ways are going to have to reclaim that as well. So if Christianity has been influenced and or taken over in some ways by Platonic ideas, then should it not also be redeemed in this new sense?
Yeah,
So
sure.
what say you, Jeremy,
Look,
on all of these things?
so much depth there, and there's so many core concepts that you're raising. I think what we need to do is kind of unpack some of these ideas
Okay.
into somewhat separate sort of themes that we can explore one by one.
Great.
And first is just the very notion of religion. Of course, if we look at the etymology of that word, it really means to be like to bind, and it's a word that arises from people feeling bound with their community, really being connected with a community. And so we can understand, if we understand religion just definitionally as a spiritual orientation that allows people to feel a sense of practice and values and ethics and in connection with their community, then of course all the work that I put forward is very much a religious in that orientation.
And do you, sorry to interrupt, do you find
Yeah.
the use of the word religion or religious ideas in that language agreeable?
Well, it's an interesting thought. And actually, I've had this conversation with a wonderful biologist, a cell biologist. His name is Ursula Goodenough, who wrote a book called The Sacred Depths of Nature. We actually had a public conversation just a few weeks ago.
I watched it.
Okay, great. So she actually has developed what's called the Religious Naturalist Association.
Yep.
She totally believes this word religion is absolutely fine. I personally, in my writings, have avoided using that word in describing what I call the web of meaning, the sense of deep interconnectedness, not because there's something fundamentally wrong with the word, but because the associations with that word are so much oriented towards organized religion, like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever, that I'm afraid that it just will get totally misunderstood. So I avoid using that word for that reason, just because of its associations, not because it's something I feel is wrong with it.
Right.
But then let's come to this notion of when I've written things that many people have seen as being sort of antagonistic to Christianity, and I want to kind of unpack that a bit. I think that's an important place to go. And what I've done, especially in the patterning instinct, as we've been in conversation about already, is looking at how this race in dualism was inherited from the Greeks, inherited by Christianity. And Christianity, in many senses, is Plato's dualism, just systematized in a far more elaborate way. And of course, it's much more than that. I don't want to minimize it in that respect, but it's very much a dualistic sort of cosmology. And what my issue is, there's a couple of issues with monotheism in general. And I have these issues just as much with Judaism. And basically, I was born Jewish and still consider myself sort of culturally Jewish or whatever. But I have an equally strong problem with Judaism and with Islam, which is that any religion that is dualistic in its fundamental will lead people and will naturally influence people to see a sort of desacralized world below and a separate sort of spirit in another dimension, rather than seeing the inherent spirituality in all of life. But having said that, I don't mean to say that that is the only way that these religions can be interpreted.
Right.
And in fact, I've had a long, really valuable, rich conversation with Matthew Fox, whom you may know some of his work.
Yep.
He's a devout Christian who spent his life describing what he calls the creation spirituality, showing that in fact there's almost like an underlying tradition in Christianity, which is really sort of characterized by, say, people like Meister Eckhart or Julian of Norwich or maybe even Aquinas, possibly.
Right.
And this is a way of looking at Christianity from that place of deep interconnectedness, from spirit being right there on earth. And in Judaism, you have the Kabbalah tradition. In Islam, you have this incredible Sufi tradition. So in each of these traditions, it doesn't mean that it's not possible to really pursue devoutly these traditions in a way that does really celebrate the spirituality of all life, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
And definitely I believe that what we need going forward is to encourage all of these interpretations. In fact, I would say like Pope Francis right now is one of the great leading systems thinkers of the world, who's basically encouraging that kind of that way of rethinking Catholicism, like from the sort of top down, from the bottom up.
Yeah.
So and so that's what important to understand. It's the dualistic notion that I have problems with, rather than the actual religion itself. Plus, there's one more dangerous element that comes from basically any kind of monotheistic religion, which essentially says, if I'm following that monotheistic religion, I must be in touch with the truth. And there's only one truth, because if there's one God and I'm worshiping that one God and he's telling me what to do or whatever, then it means that everyone who's looking at the world from a different place is not just maybe got a different perspective, they're wrong, they're misguided, and possibly they're going to go to hell or whatever. So that is another the sort of absolutism that arises from monotheism is another danger we need to be aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that explanation. I'd like to, I mean, you're the guest, but I'd like to share some perspectives and get your response to that. Following with that line of thought, number one, is Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and other religions as well, not merely going through the same evolutionary track that everyone else has been on, essentially? So if we have a quote unquote secular movement, cognitive movement from, giving earth to mechanistic to extractionism, are not religions just simply following that same particular pattern rather than being drivers of it? So that's my first question and inquiry, like how are we to think about that? And then the second is to ask, would you be agreeable to reconceiving all of the ideas that come out of the fundamental kind of originating texts of these religions? Now, I'm mostly familiar with Jewish and Christian texts. So, for example, the creation story in Genesis speaks highly of a monotheistic God, one God that created everything. But Adam, you and I are made of the Adamah. We're made out of the ground, and there's like this unity, and monotheism being not exclusionary, but inclusionary, meaning that if there is only one God, then there is only one reality and one truth, and whatever realities we might happen to see and experience are all part of that. So I have, oh my gosh, there's so many different layers of questions. I apologize. But number one, how does that sit with you? But my other question that I'm asking myself and even to the audience is, are we possibly agreeable to reconceiving all of these religious ideas, possibly in a much more originalist or indigenous kind of way, in accordance with, the work that you're doing here in trying to bring together a completely new worldview? I'd love to get your take on all of that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that one of the great treasures of our human cultural heritage is all the different religions that we have around the world.
Right.
And I think that the worst thing anybody could do would be to try to sort of fit all these different ways of making sense of these amazing, profound questions that we human beings have evolved to be able to ask. To try to fit it all into one particular cookie cutter and say, this is the right way to go, has got to be a failed enterprise and misguided to begin with. So I absolutely encourage people from every one of the great religions or other sort of wisdom traditions around the world to really interpret them in the ways that can lead to this place of flourishing. And above all, I think what is most important is each one of these does have these interpretations that can look at really what ultimately we can almost see as a kind of a shared pantheism, if you will, that every religion can lead to, which is to just kind of recognize the deep sacredness of the universe. We can have reverence for the glory of this incredible universe that is so mind-blowingly beyond even our greatest ability to conceive of from a human perspective. And we can have reverence for the divinity of all of life. And to me, that's sort of what really religion calls for in every which way. There's
Yeah.
this incredible miracle that life in its complexity emerged on this earth. Maybe it's there in millions of other planets all around the galaxy and other galaxies. We don't know. But what we do know is that the only one we know of is what evolves in this earth. And I feel like what is called for, and this really calls for a sense, almost like a religious sense of the sacred, that's available in every person, whether they are devoutly secular, whether they're reductionist, whether they see themselves as Christians or Hindu or whatever, is just to recognize that ultimately there is this divinity in all of life.
Right.
And once we start from that basis, well, it leads to this recognition that we humans are not separate from nature in this way that's causing this destruction. And it leads us to try to reevaluate what's possible. If we don't necessarily have to see ourselves as humans as being somehow bad because of the destruction we've caused or whatever, but we can see the worldviews that have led to this destruction as being things that are life right now is calling on us to reconsider, to look at different ways of meaning making that can lead us to really fulfill our potential as human beings with our technology and with everything that is so unique about us, but as part of a flourishing living earth.
Yeah, it makes me sad because, the popular press that a lot of religions get obfuscates the underlying mystical traditions. For example, the divine spark has been a part of the Christian tradition for many, many years. Houston Smith, the great religion scholar, writes about Christianity being a singularity that splays into a multiple diversity. And all these different ideas. And I don't know if this is encouraging to you, but it's part of kind of the journey that I feel like many of us are on in what is becoming a post-Christian world. That's a lot of the speak that happens in the Christian and church circles, that is re-embracing not pantheism per se, but panentheism, the idea of a unified divinity within the entirety of the creation of which we are participating. And in many ways, the encouragement for me, which is also just intriguing and fascinating, is that what's happening in those religious circles seems to dovetail very much with what you're doing in your synthesizing of science and spirituality and all that kind of stuff together too.
Yeah, no, I think that's all true, Kevin. But I was also realizing there was one other question you asked. You asked this kind of multidimensional question.
Yeah, I did.
It's equally important to look at that we haven't yet covered in the way I've been responding to it, which is this notion of if we look at something like the idea of human rights, or some of these kind of great concepts that we see in the modern world that we don't see in earlier cultures or whatever. And there's this sense that even whether it's Christianity or whether it's the modern dominant worldview, there's a strong body of philosophy or thought that says, no matter what you might say about the modernism or whatever it is, it did create concepts like justice, or a sense of shared humanity, or a sense of, even though it was a worldview that led, for example, to this hideous institution of slavery and colonialism, it was also a worldview that led to people like William Wilberforce saying, this is unacceptable, this is immoral, and we're going to do something. And you even get political groups developing, like the abolition of slavery, to first time in history, fighting for rights for people other than themselves, which is a really key way of thinking. So we need to look at that. And I do think that there are elements of that modernist worldview, which kind of led to this enlargement of the sense of the human identity, which I think what we need to recognize is not that, like, sometimes people look at this as if it's like a set of cultural evolution. Like, we started as these kind of hunter-gatherers, and all we were aware of was our little group, and then we had agrarian civilizations, and we had this bigger shared identity. Then we got to modernism, and our minds just got expanded to realize that we're part of the universe, and this sort of step up. I see it almost more circular, if you will, that actually, with the rise in agrarian civilization, we lost a lot of the great wisdom that our indigenous human traditions had. And we developed other sources of wisdom or whatever, which oftentimes connected with those indigenous ideas. A lot of what I relate to in Taoism and Buddhism and Neo-Confucianism are, if you look at their core, they arise from indigenous sense of connectedness, but then they explore it in these profound different ways. But we can really see ourselves now as having the knowledge base coming from the scientific understanding to kind of reconnect with those core moral emotions that our indigenous ancestors just had more easily or had access to more easily.
Yeah.
So I think that's important to sort of see it more like this spiral or almost like a circular sort of way of thinking about it, rather than this sort of progress, this inevitable progress we're making towards something.
What comes to mind when you say that is I feel as if there is a reclamation that you're doing of science from the reductionistic worldview.
Yes.
And there's also a movement of religion away from the parochial exclusionism. And these kind of movements are happening simultaneously in some ways. There's so many people just being so disenfranchised with the exclusionism and the misogyny and the patriarchies of religious ideas and institutions, but still longing and yearning for something that does open your heart and your mind to a much more capacious worldview of the divine in all sorts of different ways outside of the boundaries of that parochialism. So I feel like and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to chat with you so badly, because I feel like what you've given us is a really brilliant synthesis and articulation of all of that can benefit that scientific endeavor, but also benefit the religious endeavor as well. And that we can join together and in some ways synthesize the whole thing together, which is essentially what you're doing. We're trying to synthesize it all together.
Exactly. And essentially, we can even think of it as not even as joining together as they're two separate entities that then need to join, but as more recognizing that the barrier that everyone thought was there was actually just this constructed, untrue barrier to begin with. And then we can explore how a scientific understanding can lead us to these deep spiritual insights. And we can then also use science to understand those spiritual insights in deeper ways. For example, we can look at how the patterns of nature exist everywhere around us, which in itself is something like indigenous cultures or Taoism, Neo-Confucianism deeply understood. And they talk in terms of patterns. But then we can use science to actually explore those patterns and say, oh, well, here's fractality, this actual pattern that repeats itself at different scales throughout the universe. And here's like this small world network way of understanding networks, which is true for the pattern, the way things relate within each of our cells, or the way that forests relate. And so we can use science to understand things, not to then take away from their spiritual meaning, but to almost like embed further definition, richness in that spiritual meaning.
And when we do that, everything is more true and richer in our experience. And back to some of the things that we've talked about before, much more beneficial for the world in which we create. Because you mentioned the constructs that we create, like the division is just simply a construct. Yeah. So now we need the next 3 hours to talk about the development of consciousness and how we construct our realities. That's obviously for another time. Man, I could talk to you forever. So it's coming close to time. I want to be very respectful of your time, even though I'm pretty geeked out right now about all this stuff. I wanted to ask you about the word life and where life comes from, because it's very much connected to process. Life not as a thing, not as an actual thing that you get, but as a pattern and a process. But I'm not sure if we have enough time to kind of extrapolate some of those things. So I feel like that's a really important, helpful idea for people for how they create their own life. My life sucks right now, or my life is really good. But if you thought about it in a much more patterning, connected sense, then it could actually open up your mind to different imaginative possibilities for what kind of life we can create. So that's definitely in your book, The Web of Meaning. Because we're short on time, if you want to touch on that, I'd love to hear. But the question I wanted to end, Via Media is based upon this one idea that we want to inspire people to be curious and to be hopeful. And I define hope as the disciplined application of whatever you believe and your philosophy. So it's not an optimism, it's not a feeling, it's what you discipline yourself to do. And the reason why I wanted to end on that is because I think your story of how you came to all of this stuff, like, where did Jeremy come up with these ideas? Like, what was the kind of phenomenological journey of your life? I think is really powerful because it can help people connect with, I'm kind of in a similar situation, or I'm going through a similar pattern. Yeah. So would you mind sharing a little bit of your personal story and connect it with at least my definition of hope, which is a disciplined application of these beliefs or philosophy?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And see if I can do that in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But basically, I think I can write about this stuff because I spent the first half of my life basically totally embedded in this dominant worldview. I took all these ideas about humans being like separate from nature, and basically humans being somehow more important than the rest of life, and capitalism working so well because everyone just does their own selfish stuff, and that's the invisible hand that works. My life is basically lived in that kind of way, and it was only I actually started an internet company. And took it public during the first .com phase back in the late 1990s. And I was CEO and proud of myself that I was doing all this. And then I went through a phase when basically everything collapsed around me. My wife at the time, as she passed away some years back, she developed a serious illness. And I left the company really when it was still too young to leave as CEO to look after her. And then within a year or two, the company collapsed. And then I went through this whole period in my life when, even as I was looking after my wife, she was suffering cognitive decline. So I kind of lost the person the only person I'd really loved so deeply and felt so connected with. And during this it was as if like I was in this kind of meltdown of things. And I decided at that point, here I was in midlife, it wasn't like I was at the end of my life, that whatever I did in my life going forward was going to be truly meaningful. And that's what led me onto this kind of search for meaning. And I think fundamentally, I wanted it to be meaningful, not just to my head, meaning that I wanted it to be scientifically and cognitively valid, that I could really sense wasn't just sort of made up nonsense, but meaningful to my gut, to my heart, that it could feel right. And I was looking for something that could truly integrate, a way of integrating all those different parts of me. And that was the journey that led to looking at the ways different cultures made meaning out of the world to try to understand that, which is really what the patterning instinct was about. And then it was actually through that work, but through my own internal experiential work, discovering meditation, discovering traditional Chinese practices like Tai Chi and Qigong, and relating that to this cognitive understanding. It was through that I could develop what I could see as this integrated worldview. And what I really show in the Web of Meaning is not like, this is Jeremy's worldview, this is Jeremy's great insight, but rather it's a worldview that comes about through tying these connections between all these different elements and seeing how people working in climate activism, or people working in systems biology, or indigenous cultures, or all these different groups actually are coming from the same source of deeply felt recognition of our deep interdependence and interconnectedness.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. We did have one question come in. Let's see if I can get this up let's see if this works. Look at that. This is one question. Do you think humanity must overcome the problem of psychopaths, antisocials, in order to change course? If so, how do you think we can and should overcome it?
Yeah, what a great question. I don't think we need to overcome the problem of psychopaths. I think that scientists actually tell us that maybe like 2 to 3% of humans may be psychopaths congenitally, that just because of the ways in which their consciousness basically connects up from infants onward, they're unable to connect with the normal sense of empathy and caring that most human beings access naturally. So that's really what a psychopath is. And it's not that we need to overcome the psychopaths. What we need to do is rather just shift our culture so that it encourages from infancy onwards people to connect with their normal, natural human nature. Because as we evolved as humans, as I've described earlier, we evolved to care about others around us. We evolved to care about all of life around us. That is what we are as humans. That's what gives us true well-being, a true sense of profound happiness, not just from hedonic things that might feel good for a short time, but a real sense of what Aristotle called eudaimonia, sustained being. So what we need to do, both for ourselves as individuals in our own path, is reconnect with what our own heart actually calls for. And as a culture, what we need to do is, rather than teach children from early infancy to be consumers and to want more and to want greater status and to like step onto this hedonic treadmill of modern consumerism, we need to like allow them to actually grow up in what psychologist Darshana Narvaez has called the evolved nest, like the way of being with other humans around us, with other kids and other family around us, in the way that we humans evolved to be. That will lead to healthier human beings everywhere and lead ultimately to a much healthier human society.
Yeah, in many ways, this very philosophy that you're advancing is the solution, or at least one response to all of these kind of differential psychological approaches to life, right? I mean, in many ways, I mean, I've been reading a lot of Ian McGilchrist, and some of that has suggested to me as well that the worldview, the pattern that we have created as this mechanistic, extractive kind of worldview has actually given rise to all of these kind of psychological anomalies that probably didn't exist before. So if we rethought our integrative worldview, then that might actually be the answer, or at least the salve for all these kind of ailments.
I think that's right.
Yeah, we're going to end here because I need to respect your time. I got distracted with the question that came through, but I wanted to mention the big question is, how does somebody actually get to change this fundamental conceptual way in which you navigate through this world? And the reason why I think your story is so important for all of us is to recognize that sometimes that only comes through massive disruption in our lives, right? Where the way in which we think the world is working doesn't work for us anymore. It doesn't fulfill us anymore. It's an experience, it's a phenomenology. And I kind of, we don't have to answer this now, but I kind of wonder how we can maybe be much more active in creating those disruptions so that we can be much more actively, willfully trying to disrupt the worldviews by which we live, so that we can join in the great human experiment and endeavor and journey of remaking our world. So that's kind of my thought there. Jeremy, I cannot thank you enough. You are such a gift. Everybody listen, Patterning Instinct. Well, see, this is how I'm going to pay you. I'm going to do your advertising for you. Phenomenal works. What a gift. And I'm tremendously grateful to you. And I hope that some of the work that we do just helps to get the word out about what you're doing. For those of you watching, go to, I think we have the links in all of the stuff that we put for the Leology Institute, as well as the Deep Transformation Network that Jeremy has started and is leading. And he's got some great conversations on there that we encourage you all to participate in. And to all of you who are watching, thank you so much for joining our very first conversational interview with Via Media. And thank you for participating in this journey of inspiring a curious and hopeful humanity. Join us next time for our next conversation. Everything will be at the website. Jeremy, thank you so much.
And thank you, Kevin. Just a great conversation. So enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.